So what is the segregation process? Well, first of all, let's talk about segregation. And with segregation, we mean the separation of individuals into distinct parts of social life. And we do find segregations in domains such as housing, schools, workplaces, social relationships, and many more. But we also find it with respect to all kinds of attributes and characteristics. For example, with respect to ethnicity, age, gender, religious beliefs, or any other values. Not too long ago, segregation was quite prolific in the United States. Racial segregation used to be a massive issue with respect to housing, schools, and other opportunities to participate in social life.
This was Levittown, Pennsylvania, shortly after World War II, in a suburb that explicitly promised a white-only neighborhood. And it wasn't some outlier, it was the prototypical suburb built by the father of suburbia, Bill Levitt, who created several suburbs around the US, all named Levittown.
I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today.
The strange thing is that even today, we still find a lot of residential segregation. So what you see here are maps of New York in the United States and Cape Town in South Africa. And you see them color-coded with respect to the ethnic origin of the inhabitants. And what we do see is that there are very clearly segregated neighborhoods. There's the black neighborhood, the white neighborhood, the Hispanic neighborhood, and others. Interestingly, you also find segregation with respect to religious beliefs, for example, in Belfast in Northern Ireland. You clearly can identify neighborhoods where predominantly Catholics live and neighborhoods where predominantly Protestants live. Bill Bishop wrote the book, The Big Sword, where he shows this development. And in there, he also highlights about how in presidential elections, nowadays, it's almost clear who wins in which electoral district, while not so long ago, many more electoral districts were actually competitive. So something seems to be going on that segregates the voters of the two political parties in the United States into living into similar districts.
The whole country is voting today, but the election will likely be decided by a handful of swing states. That's because most states are reliably Republican or reliably Democrat, as Donald Trump and Kamala Harris claim those electoral college votes. It will bring them close, but still short of the 270 needed to win the presidency. So here are the 7 states we're focused on tonight.
The argument that Bill Bishop in his book, The Big Sword, makes is the following. Basically, he says that in the US, between 4 and 5% of the population move each year from one county to another. That's quite a lot. Now, there are all sorts of reasons for that. Having a new job, or moving closer to family, or maybe just following the sun. But more people are moving in a single year than new population is added in 4 years. So there's quite a lot of movement going on. Now, what do people do when they move from one county to another? Well, when people look for a place to live, they go through a checklist of all sorts of amenities. Is there the right coffee shop nearby? How close is the neighborhood to the center of the city? What are the rents? Or is there the right kind of church nearby?
Hey, what for the Starbucks and up here?
What do you guys want?
Let me get a fratte motete.
And then let me get a Trenta Pinkity Drinkity.
Trenta Frinkity Pinkity Dinky and a fratte mate.
What the hell?
A fratte mate and a frinkity pinkity.
Was that a pink drink and did you say cafe au lait?
Fratte mate.
And these unprecedented opportunities for mobility, where people can move from one area to the other, combined with sorting themselves into communities of like-minded people, that's the argument by Bill Bishop, has led to more segregation. Over the last 30 years, Americans dramatically clustered in such a way that they live now around people who think and are like themselves. Let's also talk about why does segregation not go away? even when people do become more tolerant. First, let's bring in a definition of the segregation process. Let me cite Brook and Mayer. They say segregation is the non-random allocation of people who belong to different groups into social positions and the associated social and physical distance between groups. Segregation per se is a static property of a population, whereas the segregation process are the actions that create and sustain this segregation. And we can put this now in the well-familiar Coleman scheme, where we have macro-level phenomena that are generated through micro-level processes. Segregation is a macro-level phenomena that we do observe, and the segregation process would be the steps and the actions that individuals do to generate this macro-level outcome. The idea in the segregation process is that it's a bit like a domino effect, a bit like a chain reaction, one thing that kicks off that leads to more segregation and so on. And what are the elements in this? When you move from one place to another, there are two things that happen. First one, the composition of the neighborhood that the moving individual leaves behind changes. When you move out of a city, there's one person less of your ethnic origin, of your age, of your educational background there than there was before. Similarly, the composition of the neighborhood that you move into changes. Suddenly, there's one more person with a white jumper and no beard anymore. The idea of segregation being the outcome of some sort of chain reaction was most profoundly developed by Thomas Schelling in his book Micromotives and Macro Behavior. Let's have a look at a wonderful video that explains this.
4 decades ago, on a long-haul flight, the economist Thomas Schelling was doodling with a pen and paper and thinking about the problem of racial segregation. When he got home, he picked up a chessboard to continue his investigations. And you can do the same thing. Simply lay out alternating black and white counters, or brown and white eggs, remove any 20 and add 5 just to mix things up a bit. The board now represents a mixed neighbourhood. Now, these brown eggs aren't extreme racists. They're happy to live in a mixed neighbourhood, but they don't want their white neighbours to outnumber their brown neighbours more than 2 to 1. The white eggs feel exactly the same way, so take any egg that is outnumbered more than 2 to 1 and move it to the nearest acceptable location. As you do this, you'll find something astonishing happen. The brown eggs and the white eggs will separate out like oil and vinegar. Even a mild preference for the colour of your neighbour can lead to extreme segregation. Thomas Schelling's chessboard experiments became famous, and Schelling himself eventually won the Nobel Prize. For me, the experiments are about more than racial segregation. They show how, although we as individuals may be rational and we may be tolerant, the society that we produce together may be neither rational nor tolerant. That's why the message of the logic of life is sometimes so surprising. Yes, the world we live in is sometimes irrational, but we aren't.
Let's illustrate this in another example. Here we have blue and yellow individuals. They could represent different sexes, different ethnic origins, different religious beliefs, or any other things. In this case, the individuals live on a two-dimensional grid where they have up to 8 neighbors around them. Actually, this neighborhood is called the Moore neighborhood. But now let's do this again and add the state of happiness to our little agents. And agents are happy when they are not outnumbered more than 2 to 1. So basically, when half of the neighborhood has the same color as them or a different color than them, they are perfectly happy. But as soon as 2/3 of the neighbors are of a different color, they become unhappy. And this is what you see in this example. So here, this yellow triangle is unhappy because it's only surrounded in its new neighborhood by blue squares. Now we can move this triangle over and it becomes happy. We can now play this out on a bigger board. So here you see a random allocation of individuals to various locations on a two-dimensional grid. And you see there are some empty spaces, and when you look a little further, you see Some individuals are happy and others are not, according to the rule that we just defined. So now you can move one individual, an unhappy individual, to somewhere where it becomes happy, and another unhappy individual, and another unhappy individual, and so forth, until at some point all individuals are happy and the whole thing reached a steady state. So maybe you see where this is going. So all these steps that I just manually did, we can also simulate on the computer. And this is exactly what I'm going to do now. So we start with a random allocation of individuals on this grid, and by chance one unhappy individual is selected and moved to another place where the individual actually becomes happy. And as you can see very quickly, we reach quite a lot of segregation in this world. Let me show you another highly stylized example where we live in a world where almost everybody is happy and almost everybody is surrounded by lots of different people of different color. There's just one individual in this example that seems to be unhappy. So let's move this individual to a spot where it becomes happy. And now what happened is that now a blue square became unhappy. Let's move this guy over here. And now we have more unhappy folks over here. And we have some unhappy blue squares, and that caused another triangle to become unhappy, and that caused another square to become unhappy. And as you can see, by starting with just one unhappy individual, we kicked off a process that led to a world that is almost entirely segregated. Okay, let me show you another example. So now let's change this threshold that individuals have for being happy or not. 33% means that they want to have at least 33% of their neighbors in their neighborhood being of the same color as themselves. And as you've seen, this leads to quite a segregated world fairly quickly. Now let's restart the board and change the threshold to a much higher value. So individuals move if less than 90% of the people around them are exactly the same as themselves. So that makes people much more intolerant. They really want to have neighbors that are of the same color as themselves. When we start this, what you see is that, interestingly, the overall level of segregation is now much lower than it was before, when individuals were more tolerant to begin with. That's fascinating. That this model is highly stylistic and artificial, but nevertheless it shows that higher levels of segregation can result from rather tolerant individual preferences. It also showed that lower levels of segregation can actually result from intolerant preferences. Schelling makes this micro-macro link explicit, and it allows us to think things through and derive new implications that we might not have. Thinking of the common sense theory that the world is segregated because people are intolerant, Schelling's model improves in two important ways. Firstly, empirically. Schelling's model is consistent with a weak relation between prejudice and segregation that we observe in the world. There does not necessarily have to be a huge amount of prejudice and discrimination for a world to enter a segregated state. Over time, increasing support for integration need not necessarily reduce segregation. Two regions that differ with respect to support for interaction can be similar with respect to segregational levels. But there's also a theoretical improvement. Schelling's model is consistent with this minimal program of sociology, where we try to explain macro phenomena as a result of macro conditions and incentive-guided, goal-directed behavior at the micro level. Overall, and this explains the title of Schelling's book, Micromotives and Macro Behavior. Micromotives are not the same as macro behavior. We can have segregation as an outcome even in a world where individuals are tolerant themselves. It is like a chain reaction that can be kicked off and leads to a process where we end up with a world that maybe nobody wants. It means we cannot necessarily deduce the micro level behavior from what we observe at the macro level. And similarly, changing the world, sometimes it's not enough to change the behavior of individuals. Sometimes we need to change about how they act and think about the dynamics that lead to the outcome at the macro level that we do observe.
And if there's too many colored people around here, I definitely will get out.
One of the main reasons was because it was a white community.
And we understood that it was going to be all white, and we were very happy to buy a home here.
All of these conditions fester for 30 years as white people flee to the brand new suburbs popping up all over the country. Many of those suburbs institute rules called covenants that explicitly forbid selling homes to black people, and all of this was perfectly legal. Now it's 1968, and MLK is assassinated.
Good evening. The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, 39
Apostle of nonviolence in the civil rights movement, has been shot to death.
Martin Luther King was shot and was killed tonight in Memphis.
In the aftermath, Congress passes the Fair Housing Act of 1968. It's a policy meant to encourage equal housing opportunities regardless of race or religion or national origin, and it offers protections for future homeowners and renters, but it does little to fix the damage already done. Over the next 50 years, the Fair Housing Act is rarely enforced. So you can still see housing segregation and its effects in Baltimore and often along any MLK Boulevard in any U.S. city, like its effects on wealth. So home ownership is the major way Americans create wealth, right? Well, discrimination in housing is the major reason that black families, up and down the income scale, have a tiny fraction of the family wealth that white families do, even white families with less education and lower incomes. For almost 30 years, 98% of FHA loans were handed out to white borrowers. Not only were black neighborhoods redlined, and not only was the Fair Housing Act selectively enforced, if at all, but it is still, today, much harder for a black person to get a mortgage or home loan than it is for a white person.
Families are fearful of speaking up about a basic human right that should be afforded to everyone in the world, but definitely in the richest country in the world.
And housing segregation in schools. The primary way that Americans pay for public schools is by paying property taxes. People who live in more valuable homes have better funded local schools, better paid teachers, better school facilities, and more resources. Here's the feedback loop. The better the schools in a neighborhood, the more those homes in that neighborhood are worth. And the higher the property values of those homes, the more money there is for schools, and so on and so on. And housing segregation in health. Because of urban planning that benefited those richer, whiter neighborhoods, people of color are more likely to live near industrial plants that spew toxic fumes. They're more likely to live far away from grocery stores with fresh food, and in places where the water isn't drinkable. They're more likely to live in neighborhoods with crumbling infrastructure and in homes with toxic paint.
When you're living with rats, roaches, and things like that, that's deplorable. You cannot have that kind of stuff with children running around in a building that may be full of lead.
And not coincidentally, people of color have higher incidences of certain cancers, asthma, and heart disease. And housing segregation in policing. Housing segregation means we are having vastly different experiences with crime and vastly different experiences with policing. Because our neighborhoods are so segregated, sometimes racial profiling can be camouflaged as spatial profiling, where living in certain areas can make you more likely to be stopped by the police. And it means that people have a lot of unnecessary contact with the criminal justice system just because of where they live.
The problem in our city, the police and the citizens are fighting. They keep targeting my brothers and sisters who don't really have nothing.
And that heavy, aggressive kind of policing that you see in black neighborhoods in particular makes people feel like they can't trust the police. And when people don't trust the police, crimes go unsolved, and people have to find other ways to keep themselves safe. But of course, it's not just Baltimore, because housing segregation and discrimination fundamentally shape the lives of people in nearly every major American city. It really is in everything.